Her son-in-law called her a freeloader and kicked her out of the house in the middle of the night. Her own daughter wouldn't even look her in the eye. She had no money, no job, no chance, until she found her mother's diary. A year later, the people who threw her out on the street had no idea who now owned the building they lived in. The rent had tripled. And that was just the first batch of consequences. Subscribe so you don't miss any more incredible stories. Comment where you're watching from. Helen Carter had always believed in the quiet strength of stability, not the loud, brash kind that drew attention or demanded applause, but the kind built steadily over decades. A home filled with warmth, dinners shared in peace, routines that anchored the day, and a partner whose presence was enough to make the world feel safe. For 32 years, that had been her life with Tom. Their house in Cedar Park stood as a testament to the decades they spent building it together. They chose the color of each wall, planted each flower in the yard, and painted the shutters by hand every 5 years. It wasn't grand, but it was theirs, and it was full of the kind of love that didn't need to be spoken aloud to be felt. But love, as she would learn, doesn't stop cancer. It doesn't hold back the slow, merciless erosion of a body or mute the sound of labored breathing. At 3 a.m., Tom had been diagnosed with lung cancer 2 years ago, and the descent had been swift. Helen had clung to hope longer than she should have, insisting on second opinions, natural supplements, and late-night prayers whispered into tear-soaked pillowcases. When he died in March, it wasn't a surprise, but it was a devastation. After the funeral, the world didn't pause, and neither did the bills. She found herself staring at utility statements and insurance forms she didn't understand, sitting in Tom's office chair long after midnight, searching for some instruction in the silence he left behind. He had always handled the finances. She had cooked, cleaned, managed the social calendars, remembered birthdays, and sent Christmas cards. They had been a unit. Now she was a fragment. The house became unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a memory. The kitchen still smelled faintly of his coffee. His reading glasses sat on the nightstand as if he might come back for them. She stopped entering their bedroom entirely, choosing instead to sleep on the living room sofa, wrapped in the afghan her mother had crocheted decades ago. Nights were the worst. There was a constant ringing in her ears, not tinnitus, but silence. Dense, suffocating silence. Money, too, began to thin out. Tom's life insurance had covered a portion of the medical bills, but the rest had been a slow bleed. Treatments, prescriptions, a hospital bed delivered to their home during the last month. She sold his car, canceled the cable, and began to pawn jewelry she hadn't worn in years. Still, the mortgage loomed. The modest pension Tom had left wasn't enough to keep the lights on and fill the fridge. It became clear. The house had to go. It was the hardest decision she had ever made. Selling the home meant erasing the last physical piece of her life with Tom, yet practicality outweighed grief. A young couple from California made an offer within days of the listing going up. Helen barely remembered the closing process. It was a blur of notaries and signatures, documents with too much fine print, and a real estate agent who spoke in clipped, efficient tones. The morning she handed over the keys, she stood on the front porch one last time, fingers brushing the worn wood of the doorframe, and whispered goodbye to the life she had built. Her daughter, Emily, had reached out during the funeral and again a few weeks later. Helen had mentioned selling the house, and Emily offered her a place to stay. "Just until you get back on your feet," she had said. Emily lived in South Austin with her husband Jason in a 2-bedroom apartment near the Greenbelt. Helen had never spent much time with them. Their visits had grown infrequent over the years, reduced to birthdays and holiday texts. Still, family was family, and Helen clung to that like a life preserver. The day she arrived, she was met with polite civility. Emily hugged her, though not tightly. Jason stood back, phone in hand, offering a brief nod. The apartment was neat, modern, decorated with shades of gray and white, lacking the warmth Helen had always favored. She was given a small room in the back, more of a converted storage space than a proper bedroom, with a single bed and a narrow window that looked out onto a brick wall. She told herself it was enough. She didn't want to impose. At first, she tried to make herself invisible. She cooked dinner without being asked: chicken piccata, lasagna, pot roast, and washed the dishes before anyone noticed. She offered to run errands, folded laundry that wasn't hers, and refilled the coffee canister when it ran low. Jason barely acknowledged her presence. Emily smiled, thanked her for the meals, and disappeared into Zoom calls and endless emails. When Helen asked questions, harmless ones like where they kept the iron or whether the trash went out on Tuesdays, Jason rolled his eyes. The first week passed in strained politeness. The second, in silence. Helen noticed the small changes. Jason would change the TV channel when she was watching a show. He left passive-aggressive notes on the fridge about household expectations. Once, she overheard him mutter "Freeloader" under his breath as he walked past her in the hallway. She told herself she imagined it. She wanted to believe the best, especially for Emily's sake, but the weight of her presence became impossible to ignore. One night, she made meatloaf, Jason's favorite, according to Emily. She set the table with care, placed the casserole in the center, and waited. Emily sat down, eyes glued to her phone. Jason opened a beer, took a bite, and said nothing for several minutes. The silence buzzed like static. Then he looked up. "You know," he began, voice flat, "maybe it's time we stop pretending this is temporary. We're not a charity." Helen blinked, frozen in place. "What do you mean?" Jason shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "I mean, how long is this supposed to go on? You're not working. You're not contributing. We've got bills." The words sliced through her, each syllable a blade. She turned to Emily, desperate for support, a single glance, a single word. Emily didn't look up. "Maybe it's best," she mumbled, "if you find something more stable, for everyone's sake." Helen didn't scream. She didn't cry. She nodded slowly, stood, and walked to her room. She packed in silence, folding sweaters with shaken hands, wrapping shoes in plastic bags, tucking away framed photographs like they were fragile bones. Her whole life fit into 2 suitcases. No one came to help. No one asked her to stay. She left just after midnight, the air heavy with the threat of rain. Jason and Emily remained inside, lights glowing behind drawn curtains. She stood on the curb for nearly an hour, unsure of where to go. Her phone battery died, her breath fogged in the cold. Her heart was a clenched fist in her chest. She took a bus to the edge of town and found a motel by the freeway, the kind with flickering neon signs and buzzing vending machines. The clerk didn't ask questions. She paid in cash. The room smelled of mildew and stale cigarettes. The sheets were threadbare, the walls paper-thin. She sat on the bed, staring at the stained ceiling tiles, and tried to feel something other than humiliation. That night, as she curled beneath the scratchy blanket, she realized something profound. She hadn't just lost her husband or her home. She had lost her place in the world. She had become invisible, and no one, not even her own daughter, had noticed. She didn't sleep. The tears came in waves, not loud or violent, but quiet, steady, and endless. In that silence, something shifted. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was a recognition, a sobering truth. They had discarded her, and she had nowhere to go but forward. The motel room was quiet, except for the mechanical hum of the vending machine just outside the door and the occasional rumble of a passing truck on the highway. Helen lay stiff on the bed, a thin floral comforter pulled up to her chin, though it did little to ward off the chill that crept through the cracked window pane. Morning light, pale and indifferent, filtered through faded curtains, illuminating the water-stained ceiling where a brown patch slowly expanded outward like a wound that would never heal. She hadn't slept. Her body had shut down for moments here and there, collapsing into brief, unsatisfying slumber that brought no rest. Mostly, she stared. At the ceiling, at the peeling paint, at the shadow her suitcase cast on the opposite wall. There were no dreams anymore, only memories that looped endlessly like a broken record, each one skipping at the same place. Emily's silence, Jason's sneer, the slam of the apartment door behind her. She stayed in that room longer than she planned. At first, she told herself it would be for just a few nights, until she found her footing, until something turned up. But days became a week, and the week stretched like a taut wire into something longer, harder to name. Time became a shapeless blur. Mornings came with cold coffee from the motel's lobby thermos and expired Danish pastries wrapped in cellophane. Afternoons passed with slow walks to nowhere. She sat on benches in public parks, watching parents push strollers, students scrolling on their phones, people going about lives that still made sense. Helen was not ashamed of being poor. She had never been rich, but she felt something worse, erased. People didn't meet her eyes anymore. At the grocery store, when she asked for help finding an item, the cashier's voice took on the brittle tone reserved for those who lingered too long in the cereal aisle. When she walked into a staffing agency in downtown Austin and asked about part-time work, the young woman at the front desk smiled with professional pity and handed her a generic flyer on re-entering the workforce after a long break. Helen thanked her, folded the paper into her purse, and never looked at it again. Her phone, an old model with a cracked screen, finally gave out one afternoon after she used it to call Emily for the third time in a week. She hadn't answered any of the previous messages, brief, gentle things like, "I hope you're doing okay," or just wanted to say I love you. Helen had stopped expecting a reply, but she called anyway, needing to fill the silence with something that sounded like connection. When the phone died mid-ring and refused to come back on, she felt strangely relieved. Now she had an excuse to stop trying. She wandered one day into a grocery store near the motel. Her funds were thinning rapidly, and the balance on her debit card was barely enough to cover a week's worth of essentials. She walked the aisles slowly, calculating the cost of each item, placing things back on the shelf with the quiet shame of someone who had once clipped coupons only as a hobby, not a necessity. Her cart held a small bag of rice, a few cans of beans, instant coffee, and a dented box of crackers. She skipped the fruit aisle entirely. She spent most of her time in the motel room. There wasn't much to do. The television only picked up a few channels, static-laced infomercials and dated sitcom reruns. She tried reading an old novel someone had left in the dresser drawer, but the words refused to settle. Her attention wandered, and every paragraph reminded her of something else. Tom's voice, Emily's laugh when she was 8 years old, the smell of cinnamon rolls baking on Christmas morning. The worst part was the evenings. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the orange glow faded into night, Helen felt the crushing weight of her aloneness. It wasn't just the absence of people. It was the absence of witness. No one knew where she was. No one cared. She could vanish, and it would take days, weeks maybe, for anyone to notice. One night, desperate for a fragment of comfort, she retrieved a small cardboard box from under her bed, the only personal item she had managed to save from her home before leaving Emily's apartment. Inside were faded photographs, a few letters from Tom, and a tiny velvet pouch containing her mother's wedding ring. She turned each item over in her hands like they were relics from a former life. At the bottom of the box was something she didn't remember packing, a leather-bound diary, worn and softened by time. The initials E.C. were barely visible on the cover. Eleanor Carter, her mother. Helen blinked, heart thudding. She hadn't seen the diary in decades. She wasn't even sure she had ever read it. Perhaps she had assumed it was filled with grocery lists and Sunday musings, but now, in the stillness of her exile, it beckoned with unfamiliar urgency. She lit the rusted lamp on the nightstand and opened the book. At first, the entries were simple. Notes about weather, mentions of Helen's childhood milestones, occasional complaints about the cost of milk. But as she turned the pages, the tone shifted. There were gaps in the narrative. Then a sudden entry, dated June 1985. He came again today. He always comes in secret. He says he loves me, says he wishes things were different, that he could marry me, if not for his wife, his children, his name. Helen stared at the ink, her pulse quickening. She read the sentence again and again. Helen must never know. I just pray that someday she understands she was not a mistake. She was love, just hidden. She sat frozen, the book trembling in her hands. Her mother had had an affair. She had kept it secret all her life. Helen turned the page, fingers suddenly stiff. There were other entries, mentions of envelopes of money, meetings in hotels, a man known only by his initials, HJS. One entry referenced a lawyer, Leonard Goldstein, who would know what to do if something happens. Helen's breath caught in her throat. Leonard Goldstein. She had heard that name before, on some letterhead from years past, tucked into a folder with tax documents. But more than that, the name felt important, tangible, real. She spent the next 2 days in the library using the public computer to search. Her fingers stumbled on the keys, but she persisted, driven by something deeper than curiosity. She found an obituary for a man named Harold James Sterling, founder and CEO of Sterling Energy. Died in 2002. Prominent, respected, powerful, survived by his wife and 3 children. Her stomach flipped. She dug further and found references to Leonard Goldstein, a now retired estate attorney with a quiet practice in Dallas. She didn't call him. Not yet. Her voice still cracked too easily. Her hands shook when she dialed. Instead, she did the only thing that felt natural. She wrote a letter. In careful cursive, on a yellow legal pad, she explained who she was. She told him about her mother, about the diary, about the initials, the suspicion. She didn't ask for money. She asked for a conversation. Then she folded the letter, sealed it, and mailed it from the post office 2 blocks from the motel. The woman at the counter didn't look twice. She walked back in the cold. Her coat was too thin, her shoes too worn. But for the first time in weeks, something stirred beneath the surface of her grief. Not hope, not yet, but the faintest shadow of momentum. A thread, however thin, that might lead somewhere. Back in her motel room, she placed the diary gently on the nightstand, next to Tom's last photograph. Then she sat down and waited. For what, she didn't know. Only that she wasn't done. Not yet. The letter arrived in a plain white envelope with no return address. Helen found it waiting at the front desk of the motel, handed to her by a weary-eyed clerk who didn't bother to ask for identification. It was early afternoon and the air outside was dense with the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. She took the envelope in both hands, heart thudding. Her name was written on the front in slanted cursive, a style she didn't recognize, formal, precise, as if shaped by a fountain pen instead of a ballpoint. She didn't open it immediately. She carried it back to her room like it might break if she moved too quickly, like it might disappear if she blinked too long. Once inside, she laid it carefully on the small wooden desk beside her untouched coffee. The motel room looked exactly as it always did, impersonal, stale, and humming faintly from a loose electrical outlet. Yet, in that moment, with the envelope before her, it felt transformed. Not warmer, not kinder, but changed. She sat down slowly and broke the seal. The letter inside was brief, typed. No signature at the bottom, only a name. Leonard Goldstein. Dear Miss Carter, your letter reached me last week. I knew Eleanor Carter. She was a remarkable woman, one I remember with great respect and fondness. If you're able to travel to Dallas, I would very much like to speak with you in person. There is something you need to see. Please contact my assistant to arrange a time at your convenience. I'm retired, but still keep an office for matters such as these. I look forward to meeting you. There was a phone number scrawled in ink at the bottom. Helen read the letter 3 times before folding it again and placing it gently back in the envelope. Her fingers trembled slightly. She didn't know what she expected. Dismissal, maybe. Polite disinterest. Certainly not confirmation. Not that he had known her mother. Not that there was something she needed to see. The following morning, she took the earliest Greyhound to Dallas. She had never been fond of buses, the smell, the claustrophobia, the unpredictable stops, but the journey passed in a haze. Her suitcase was only half packed, and she wore the same coat she had arrived in at Emily's apartment that cold night. As the city grew closer, her stomach tightened with something she couldn't quite name. Not dread, not quite hope either. It was the anticipation of a door opening in a house she hadn't realized she'd been locked outside of her whole life. Leonard Goldstein's office sat in an aging brick building tucked between a dental clinic and a tax attorney. The brass letters beside the door were faded but still legible. She climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor, pausing twice to catch her breath. At the top was a dark wooden door, slightly ajar, through which came the scent of old paper and polished wood. A young woman with tightly curled hair and tortoiseshell glasses greeted her and offered a glass of water. "He'll be with you shortly," she said, gesturing to a worn leather sofa in the waiting room. Helen sat down, gripping her knees. Her heart was racing. Minutes later, a tall, thin man in a navy cardigan emerged from the back office. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his face bore the soft folds of someone who had spent a lifetime thinking more than speaking. When he saw her, he stopped. "You look like her," he said quietly. Helen stood. "You knew my mother?" "I did," he replied, his voice thick. "Eleanor was one of the kindest women I've ever met." He extended his hand. "Come in, there's much to discuss." The office was dim and lined with the bookshelves that sagged under the weight of legal tomes and dusty files. A single window overlooked the alley. Helen took the chair across from his desk, which was neat except for one item. A sealed envelope resting in the center, its paper yellowed with age. Leonard sat down slowly. "I want you to know," he began, "that your mother never asked for anything. She was proud, maybe too proud, but she also loved fiercely, especially you." Helen swallowed. I didn't know any of this, not until I read her diary. I wasn't sure I'd ever hear from you, he said, but I kept this just in case. He pushed the envelope toward her. It's from Harold. She stared at the name. It wasn't just initials anymore. It had a shape, a weight. Harold James Sterling, she said aloud. Leonard nodded. Founder of Sterling Energy. He met your mother in the late 70s. They were close, closer than most people in his position were ever allowed to be. He was married, a public figure. You understand the implications. Helen opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a letter written in graceful cursive. The ink was faded but legible. To my daughter, Helen Louise Carter, I wish I had the courage to write this in life, not in death. I have always known about you. Your mother told me everything. I visited when I could, in ways that would not bring shame or scandal to either of you. It was never enough, and I know that. I was a coward. I chose my name over my blood. That choice haunts me. But I made arrangements, quiet ones. I did what I could to ensure that if you ever came seeking answers, you would not be met with an empty door. I asked Mr. Goldstein to hold this letter and other things in trust. They are yours. You are my daughter, my blood. And though I cannot rewrite the past, I hope this gives you something of a future. Helen read the letter 3 times, eyes burning. The words blurred, but the meaning didn't. For the first time in her life, she was being claimed. Not hidden, not minimized, claimed. Leonard slid a thick folder across the desk. This is what he left. It's not part of his estate, technically. These were private holdings, protected through various legal mechanisms. He was a smart man, careful. Helen opened the folder. Inside were pages, documents, account summaries, titles, a modest investment portfolio, 2 accounts with considerable balances, partial ownership in a commercial property in San Antonio, a line of credit backed by land deeds. She flipped through the figures, unable to process them all at once. The total value, as best as she could estimate, exceeded $1 million. She looked up slowly. This is real? Leonard smiled. Very real. It always was. Helen didn't cry. She sat perfectly still, the papers resting in her lap, the air in the office suddenly too dense to breathe. It wasn't the money that stunned her. It was the shift in narrative. Her life had always felt like a quiet background story, supporting characters, borrowed space. Now, for the first time, she was at the center of something. She belonged to a story that mattered. She left the office in a daze, folder clutched to her chest like a child carrying home a school project. The Dallas streets were loud and indifferent, but she barely noticed. She walked for an hour before finding a small cafe and sitting in the corner with a cup of tea that went cold in her hands. That night, back in her motel room, she didn't sleep. She sat cross-legged on the bed, reviewing every page, every number, every clause in the folder. She called no one. There was no one to call. She simply existed in the quiet thunder of realization. The next morning, she checked out of the motel. She found a temporary rental downtown, a clean, modern studio with hardwood floors and a washer-dryer combo that worked without kicking. She bought herself a new coat. She took long walks in the early morning when the city was still stretching awake, and no one expected her to be anyone but who she was. Over the next few weeks, she enrolled in an online course on property investment. She read books about trusts, LLCs, estate law. She began to understand the language of money, of protection, of structure. Not to get rich, not to seek revenge, but to never, ever be powerless again. Each day, she grew steadier. Each night, the silence no longer sounded like abandonment. It sounded like potential. A space to be filled not with sorrow, but with something new, something hers. Helen had never imagined herself as someone who would own anything again, let alone the kind of assets detailed in the folder now tucked away in the locked drawer of her desk. The numbers had initially overwhelmed her, digits and zeros strung together in a language she had never spoken fluently. But she was learning, slowly, steadily, deliberately. She was no longer the woman waiting for someone to save her, to validate her, to invite her back into the rooms she'd been pushed out of. She had discovered that power could be quiet, hidden under neatly pressed collars and soft words, and she intended to wear it that way. Her new apartment in downtown Austin was small but clean, with sunlight that poured in every morning through wide windows. The walls were blank, the furniture minimal. It was the first space in years that felt unclaimed by anyone but her. She took her time filling it. One lamp, one chair, a single framed photo of Tom on the kitchen counter, beside a fresh bouquet of tulips that she replaced weekly. She didn't need clutter, she needed clarity. Each morning began with a ritual. She brewed coffee, opened her laptop, and studied. She read about tax shelters and trusts, about LLCs and real estate codes, about the subtle difference between leverage and risk. She took notes in a lined notebook and watched videos of realtors dissecting market trends like surgeons. It became her new language. Each term, each acronym became a tool, each day another step into territory she had once considered forbidden. It was during one of those early searches that she stumbled upon the listing. She hadn't been looking for anything specific, just scrolling through properties out of curiosity, testing her newfound literacy against real-world examples. The listing was buried on a niche auction platform, the kind most people never bothered with. A multi-unit residential building on the east side of Austin, designated distressed, facing auction due to unpaid taxes and deferred maintenance. The images showed cracked sidewalks, peeling paint, outdated fixtures, but the bones were good. The location, excellent. The potential, unmistakable. She read the listing again. The address rang like a bell in her chest. It was the building Emily and Jason lived in. She stared at the screen for a long time, uncertain whether to trust her memory, but there was no mistake. The faded blue trim, the low iron gate, the brick mailbox cluster with 2 broken locks. She had stood on that sidewalk before. She had watched the windows glow from a bench across the street. Helen's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she didn't know whether to feel horror or awe. The universe had folded in on itself, placed this moment in her lap like a gift or a test. She closed her eyes, saw again that dinner table, Jason's smug face, Emily's downturned eyes, the weight of silence that crushed her as she stood up and packed her things. That apartment had been the site of her unmaking. Now it was for sale. The thought of vengeance did not take root. Not really. It flickered, shallow and cold, but quickly extinguished. She didn't want to destroy anyone. That was never the point. What she wanted, what she craved, was restoration. Not of what she had lost. That life was gone, but of the self that had been stripped from her piece by piece. And this building, this opportunity, might be her first act in taking that self back. She called Leonard. "I found something," she said simply. He didn't ask questions. Within days, the LLC was formed. HLC Holdings, masked through a privacy trust to keep her name out of public records. A neutral shell company with an Austin address and a nondescript name. Leonard handled the filings, the tax strategy, the legal buffers. Helen funded the escrow account with wired assets from the trust her father had left. Everything was clean, quiet, legal. 2 weeks later, she won the auction. The building was hers. She sat alone in her apartment the night after the deal closed, the official deed resting on the coffee table like a relic. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked it up. Her name wasn't on it, but she knew. She had purchased the building in full. No mortgage, no loan. She was the legal owner of the very place she had been discarded from. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like reclamation. The first letter went out 2 days later, a formal notice to all tenants about reassessment of lease terms, upcoming property inspections, and planned improvements. Helen worked with a local property management firm she'd interviewed anonymously, selecting one with experience in tenant relations and distressed properties. She made it clear that the building would be renovated, upgraded, and brought into compliance with code. There would be fairness, transparency, but also order. For most tenants, the changes were welcome. Repairs that had been delayed for years were suddenly completed. Broken outdoor lights were fixed. Mailboxes were replaced. Trash pickup became regular. Helen invested steadily, not extravagantly, but with purpose. The plumbing was addressed. New landscaping was added. A fresh coat of paint transformed the building's tired exterior into something bright and new. For Jason and Emily, however, the letter meant something else entirely. Their rent, like all tenants, was adjusted to reflect market value. But because they had been under a drastically outdated lease, their increase was sharp. Tripled, in fact, based on square footage and local comps. The property manager sent out individual notices. Helen didn't need to witness Jason's reaction to know what it would be. Instead, she watched the building from afar. Occasionally, she drove by at dusk, pulling into the grocery store parking lot across the street. She sat in her car, engine off, lights dimmed, and stared at the windows that had once framed her shame. She imagined the arguments. Jason's voice rising, Emily's attempts to pacify him. She pictured them standing in the same kitchen, at the same table, reading the letter together and realizing they were now subject to someone else's rules. They had no idea that the landlord they cursed was the same woman they had once called a burden. Emily called 2 days later. Helen didn't answer. There was a voicemail, soft, hesitant, a crack in the voice she hadn't heard in years. "Mom, I don't know if you heard, but something's going on with the building. Our rent went up, like, a lot. Jason's not taking it well. I don't know. Can we talk?" Helen sat in silence after listening to it, the phone still warm in her hand. She didn't press play again. She didn't delete it. She simply placed the phone face down on the table and stared at the wall for a long time. The building became her project, her focus. She kept a meticulous file on every unit, every repair request, every improvement. Her evenings were spent reviewing contractor estimates and balancing expenses. She didn't lavish the property. She refined it. Slowly, thoughtfully. The changes benefited everyone. Everyone except the ones who had once pushed her out. Jason grew restless. His complaints came through the tenant portal. First civil, then angry, then borderline aggressive. He accused the management company of price gouging, of negligence, of unfair targeting. Helen responded with policy, with clauses, with legal procedure, through the property manager always. She never used her name. She never raised her voice. That was the power of anonymity. They couldn't see her coming. She began dressing differently. Cleaner lines, stronger fabrics, no makeup, just presence. She wore sunglasses when she passed through the building, a blazer when she met with contractors. No one recognized her. Not the neighbors, not the mail carrier, not even Emily when they passed each other one afternoon in the parking lot. Helen had been invisible once because no one cared to see her. Now, she was invisible by design. She started attending small business seminars, real estate mixers, and investment luncheons. She went by her middle name, Louise, in those rooms. No one asked about her past. They saw a woman with a sharp gaze and a quiet voice who knew how to write checks and ask good questions. They saw value. One evening, as she reviewed inspection photos, she paused on one that showed Jason and Emily's unit. The window blinds were half drawn. A single lamp glowed behind them. The photo was dated, time-stamped. Helen stared at it for a long time. It was the same room where she had once folded laundry, cooked dinners, held her breath. Now it was hers. She leaned back in her chair, fingertips pressed together, and whispered into the dimness of her apartment. "I'm not finished yet." Helen watched the world shift in small, deliberate increments. She had expected Jason to unravel, though perhaps not as quickly as he did. He had always walked with the confidence of a man who believed nothing could touch him. But men like him, entitled, impatient, self-important, often buckled under the pressure of uncertainty, and she had given him plenty of it. The rent increase hit harder than he let on. The first month he paid without comment, though the payment came late. The second, the frustration began to bleed through his communications. The third brought open hostility. He sent long, rambling emails to the property management office, each one a study in desperation disguised as indignation. He accused them of corruption, demanded itemized breakdowns, threatened legal action. Helen read every word with quiet, measured attention. She never replied directly. That was the beauty of structure. She didn't need to. The management team she'd hired, experienced and professional, responded with impeccable politeness, citing lease clauses and city ordinances. Meanwhile, she continued with the renovations. More subtle changes, more upgrades that improved the property for all tenants except the one who resented them. Jason refused to acknowledge the benefit. He was too focused on what he had lost: control, leverage, the illusion of superiority. Emily, on the other hand, had grown quieter in the reports. Maintenance workers noted her absence from common areas, her tendency to avoid eye contact. A neighbor once mentioned seeing her crying in the stairwell. Helen listened without inserting herself. She wasn't seeking retribution. She was watching gravity work. When people make choices, they eventually meet the ground that those choices pull them toward. She wasn't pushing. She had merely stepped out of the way. Emily continued to call. Not daily, not insistently, but with a persistence that was harder to ignore. Sometimes it was a voicemail, soft, tentative, rarely more than a minute long. Other times a text. "Hey, can we talk?" Or, "I'm sorry, I miss you." Helen read them all and replied to none. Not yet. She couldn't. The ache in her chest hadn't softened. Forgiveness wasn't a switch she could flip. It was a garden, still overgrown with weeds. Then came the day Emily appeared at her door. Helen had returned from a meeting with her property manager, arms full of documents and receipts, her hair pinned back, heels clicking against the tile. She was setting her keys down when the buzzer rang. The sound startled her. It was rare for anyone to visit unannounced. She pressed the intercom, heart stammering. "Hi, it's Emily. I was wondering if you're home." Helen didn't speak. Her hand hovered over the button, mind racing. Then, slowly, she pressed the door release. 10 minutes later, a knock echoed through her apartment. She opened the door to find her daughter standing there, damp from the drizzle, eyes red-rimmed, a paper grocery bag clutched to her chest. Inside were a carton of eggs, a loaf of bread, and a bottle of store-brand shampoo. Helen stepped aside without a word, letting her enter. Emily moved like a shadow, quiet and unsure. She sat on the edge of the couch, her shoulders hunched, her fingers wrapped tightly around the handles of the bag. Helen offered tea. They drank in silence. Finally, Emily spoke. Her voice was soft and uneven. "He's not who I thought he was, Jason. I thought he was just stressed, overworked, trying to be responsible. But it's more than that." Helen said nothing. She watched her daughter with the kind of careful patience she had once reserved for mending torn seams and burned dinners. Emily went on, haltingly. "He's angry all the time. He checks my phone, my email. Last week he followed me to work, accused me of hiding things, said I was conspiring against him, that I must know who owns the building, that maybe I was involved." Helen didn't blink. Emily's hands trembled. "I lied. I told him I hadn't spoken to you, that I didn't even know where you lived. But that wasn't true. I figured it out. I saw the notices, the name of the management company. I followed the trail." Helen sipped her tea. The steam curled gently in the space between them. "I miss you," Emily whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. "But I don't know how to fix it." "You can't," Helen said finally. "Not all at once." Emily looked up, startled by the softness in her mother's tone. "You didn't just let him push me out," Helen continued. "You stood with him, and that choice has consequences." Emily nodded slowly. "I know." They sat together for a long time, the silence between them no longer hostile but tentative, curious. Helen didn't offer comfort, not yet. She allowed her daughter to sit with the discomfort she had once inflicted. It wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. When Emily rose to leave, she paused at the door. "I'm sorry," she said, "for everything." Helen didn't respond. She simply held her daughter's hand a moment longer than expected. Emily left quietly, the door clicking shut behind her like a breath held too long. The days that followed brought new reports. Jason was becoming erratic. He argued with neighbors, shouted at delivery drivers. He accused the maintenance crew of stealing tools. The property manager documented everything. One morning, Helen received a written complaint from a tenant who had overheard a violent argument through the walls. Jason yelling about losing control, Emily sobbing in the background. Helen didn't react outwardly. She read the reports, filed them, and continued her work. She scheduled another round of improvements: hallway lighting, exterior security cameras, a repainting of the stairwells. All of it within budget, all of it justified. Jason, of course, viewed it as a personal attack. He began leaving angry notes under the management office door. They were poorly written, full of spelling errors and accusations. Each one Helen filed away without comment. Emily stopped calling. She began texting instead. The messages were short. "Can we talk? Are you okay? I need you." They came late at night, the kind of hour when people are most honest with themselves. Helen read them, heart aching, but she still didn't respond. One afternoon, the building manager emailed her with an attached report. It included photos of Jason and Emily's apartment. The place was in decline. The bathroom tiles were cracked, mold creeping along the corners. The kitchen was cluttered, the blinds torn. The mail was stacking up inside the door. They were falling apart. Helen closed her laptop and stared out the window. The sky was gray and heavy. She thought of Emily as a child, wild curls bouncing as she ran down the hallway, barefoot and fearless. She thought of Sunday mornings making pancakes together, of dance recitals, of whispered bedtime stories about stars and bravery. And now this. This wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't triumph. It was watching someone you love unravel and knowing you couldn't catch them until they reached for you first. Jason began working more hours. Neighbors whispered about financial trouble. Emily was seen walking to work alone, often underdressed for the weather. The cracks in their life became visible to anyone who looked. One evening, Helen drove past the building again. She sat in her car, engine off, watching the windows. Jason's silhouette moved in the kitchen, pacing. Emily was a shadow at the table, head in her hands. The light flickered once, then steadied. Helen didn't stay long. Back home, she sat with her tea, the warmth grounding her. She held her phone in her hand, reading the last message Emily had sent. "I really need you." She didn't reply, not because she didn't want to, but because the silence still needed to be heard. The days following Emily's last message passed in a hush, like the quiet moments before the thunder rolls in. Helen had come to understand silence in all its shades, how it could heal, how it could punish, and how, when used with precision, it could become the sharpest instrument of all. She didn't text back, though her fingers hovered over the screen more than once, tempted to offer a sliver of comfort, to ease the weight pressing on both their chests. But comfort given too soon risked undoing everything. It would rescue without responsibility, forgive without transformation. Instead, she waited. The next round of property updates went out as scheduled. The property manager sent notices about lobby repairs, mandatory inspection appointments, and upcoming meetings for all residents. Helen wrote the bullet points herself, clear, concise, and blandly professional. At the end of the notice, a single line: ownership will be represented at the upcoming meeting regarding future improvements. Questions and concerns will be addressed directly. She knew Jason would come. He couldn't resist confrontation. His control had eroded steadily over the past months, and he was grasping for anything solid to blame. The idea that someone, some faceless, nameless figure, was controlling his rent, his living conditions, his entire domain would be intolerable. And now, with a time and place where that figure would supposedly appear, he would show up, he would demand, he would explode. Helen prepared with care. On the morning of the meeting, she dressed with deliberate restraint. A slate gray blazer, crisp dark jeans, clean leather boots. Her hair was pulled back in soft waves, her expression neutral, unassuming. She looked like any other professional woman arriving to speak at a property meeting. She looked like no one Jason or Emily would remember. The meeting was scheduled for 6 p.m., held in the building's common room. A long, rectangular space with folding chairs, fluorescent lighting, and the faint smell of dust that clung to buildings too long neglected. She arrived early, taking her seat quietly near the back. The property manager stood at the front, arranging a stack of printed agendas and nodding at tenants as they filtered in. Helen watched them trickle in. Young couples, older residents, 2 college students with backpacks slung over one shoulder. And then, almost exactly on the hour, Jason entered. His stride was wide, purposeful, his mouth set in a tight line. Emily followed a few steps behind, her posture wilted, eyes scanning the room as though expecting an ambush. Jason marched to the front without sitting, arms crossed over his chest. "Where is she?" he barked. "You said the owner would be here?" The property manager raised a brow but remained composed. "All questions will be addressed after the agenda presentation." Jason scoffed loudly and dropped into a chair. Emily took a seat beside him, her hands clasped in her lap, eyes cast downward. Helen stayed where she was, unnoticed. Her pulse was steady. She had imagined this moment 100 times in the stillness of her apartment. In those imaginings, she always spoke with fire, with vindication. But now, here in the heavy fluorescent silence of the common room, she felt only the gravity of the moment. No rage, no triumph. Only truth, cold and clear. The meeting began. The property manager went through the updates methodically. Repairs to the front stairwell, improvements to insulation, new lighting in the parking area. A few tenants asked about parking assignments and noise complaints. Jason sat with his arms folded, barely listening. Then came the closing note. "We'd like to thank HLC Holdings for their continued investment in the building," the manager said. "The owner's here today, should anyone wish to speak with her directly." The room shifted. Jason straightened, eyes scanning. "Her?" Helen stood. She didn't speak at first. She walked slowly to the front, her heels muffled against the aging tile floor. She faced the room, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. There was a beat of silence, broken only by the dull hum of the overhead lights. "My name is Helen Carter," she said evenly. "I'm the owner of this building." Gasps were quiet but audible. Chairs creaked. Emily went rigid. Jason's eyes widened, his mouth opening in disbelief before slamming shut again like a trap springing closed. Helen continued. "Some of you may recognize my name. Some of you won't. That's not important. What is important is this building and the people in it. I purchased it not as a gesture of punishment or ego, but because it deserved better. You all deserve better." Jason shot to his feet. "You? This is some kind of joke. You're behind this? You raised our rent, made us jump through hoops. This is revenge." She turned her eyes on him, calm and clear. "No, Jason, this is business." His face flushed deep red. "You manipulated everything. You've been playing games this whole time, hiding behind lawyers and companies and contracts. You're trying to ruin us." "I gave you a home," she said softly. "I made improvements. I treated every tenant equally. What I didn't do was forget." The room was silent. Jason stepped forward, nostrils flaring. "You think you've won? You think this makes you better?" Emily rose from her seat and stepped between them. "Jason," she said, her voice sharp, "stop!" He blinked, stunned. "What did you just—" "I said, stop," she repeated, louder now. "She's not your enemy. She never was. You are." There was a silence so profound it seemed to hollow out the room. Jason looked at her as though seeing her for the first time and not liking what he saw. His lip curled. He muttered something under his breath and stormed out, the door banged shut behind him. Emily turned to Helen, eyes wide and wet. "I didn't know," she whispered, "about the building, the money, any of it." Helen nodded once. "I know." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you had to see it, not just hear it." Emily looked down, then back at her mother. There were tears in her eyes, but no pleading, no excuses. Jason didn't return that night, nor the next. The building manager reported a moving truck idling in the lot early one morning, then gone by sunrise. Helen received a call from Emily 2 days later. "He's gone," she said quietly. "Left a note. Said you ruined his life. Said he was being hunted." Helen listened. She didn't respond right away. "I'm sorry," Emily added, "for thinking he deserved my silence." "You were scared," Helen said gently. "I've been there. Fear makes you small, but you don't have to stay that way." After the meeting, Helen walked home slowly, the weight of everything behind her lifting piece by piece. She felt no elation, no righteous high, only something quieter, something deeper. Peace, maybe, or the start of it. Later that week, Emily knocked on her door again. This time, she wasn't crying, she wasn't apologizing. She was holding something in her hands. It was a small leather diary. Helen's breath caught. "I found it," Emily said, "in the back of my closet, from the last time I came here. I think you left it behind." Helen took it gently. It was her mother's diary, the one that had changed everything. "I read some of it," Emily said quickly. "I wasn't trying to pry, I recognized her handwriting. I was looking for something that made sense." They sat together on the couch. No tea this time, just stillness. "I didn't know about Harold Sterling," Emily said, "or the money, or the trust, any of it." Helen nodded slowly. "I didn't either, not until I had nothing left to lose." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was helpless. That night, you closed the door on me. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have money. I didn't even have a place to cry where someone wouldn't knock and tell me to keep it down." Emily looked down, shame curling through her features. "That diary reminded me I mattered," Helen continued, "that my mother didn't just love me. She protected me, silently, without ever being able to show it." Emily's voice broke. "I don't know how I became the kind of daughter who could do what I did." Helen stood and walked to the window. Outside, the street lights had just blinked on, casting golden puddles on the asphalt. "You didn't become her all at once," Helen said. "It was small choices, letting things slide, choosing peace over truth. Believing love meant loyalty, even when it hurt." Emily crossed the room slowly. "I've left him," she said. "He came back once, screaming. I changed the locks, filed paperwork. I don't know who I am without him, but I'd rather find out than keep disappearing." They stood together in silence. "I want to fix things," Emily said. "I can't erase what I did, but I want to try." Helen looked into her daughter's eyes. For the first time in a long time there was no fog between them. "You see me now," Helen said. "That changes everything." They sat side by side on the couch, not speaking, not needing to. For the first time, their silence was not a weapon. It was a bridge. When Emily left that evening, she paused at the door. "You didn't raise me to be weak," she said. "I just forgot how strong you were." Helen smiled, quiet and small. "No," she replied. "You didn't forget. You just stopped looking." Helen had always thought of endings as sharp things, sudden, final, echoing with the snap of something breaking. But when the true ending arrived, it did not crash or burn. It drifted in quietly, soft as dusk. And by the time it came, she had already begun to live in the beginning that followed it. The email from Jason came on a Tuesday morning. The subject line was all caps, desperate and clenched. "We need to talk now." She almost didn't open it. The name alone sent a familiar tightening through her chest, an involuntary response like a muscle remembering injury. But curiosity, sharpened by months of watching him unravel, pulled her in. The message was long, rambling, punctuated by typos and threats. He knew everything now. He had pieced it all together. Her ownership of the building, the hidden inheritance, the connection to Harold Sterling. Whether he'd found old documents, spoken to someone in confidence, or simply obsessed long enough to dig through the right bureaucratic shadows, she couldn't say. But he knew. He accused her of deception, manipulation, of orchestrating a vendetta to ruin his life. He threatened to go public, to speak to the press, to destroy her reputation and expose her mother's affair. He framed himself as a victim, cornered and hunted, grasping for some sense of control. There was venom in his tone, but also panic. The email was less a threat than a confession of collapse. Helen didn't respond. She forwarded the message to Leonard with a brief note. He's made his move. By the end of the week, Jason received a cease and desist letter drafted in formal, surgical language. It outlined his multiple violations: written harassment, attempts to impersonate legal counsel, tampering with property records, digital harassment through tracked IP activity, and defamation. It warned of swift legal consequences should he continue. He didn't respond publicly. He couldn't afford to. A second letter followed days later, accompanied by legal documents and statements from tenants who had filed complaints against him. There were records, logs, and even audio from common spaces where his outbursts had been caught by security cameras Helen had discreetly installed months earlier. It wasn't a war. It was an unmasking. And Jason, for all his threats, folded. He disappeared before the end of the month, left town quietly, likely to another state, another job, another identity to rebuild. His social media filled briefly with vague posts about betrayal, about corruption, about being driven out by liars and snakes. But he named no one. Helen's attorney responded with one last formal warning. Any mention going forward will be considered defamation and subject to civil suit. He deleted the posts within hours. It was over. Not loudly, not violently, just gone. Emily called the morning she found the note Jason left behind. Her voice was calm but brittle. "He's gone," she said. "He packed up while I was at work, left a duffel bag of my things on the porch and took the rest. I don't think he's coming back." Helen said nothing at first. "I feel numb," Emily added, "like something heavy just fell off me and I don't even know where to begin." "You begin by staying upright," Helen said. "Then you take the next step, and the next." And Emily did. She moved out of the building within a month, found a small studio closer to her work. She began therapy, attended a community art class on Thursday nights. She painted again, something she hadn't done since college. She called Helen more often, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to sit in silence together over coffee. One afternoon, she brought Helen a canvas. It was abstract, deep reds and golds layered with sweeping brushstrokes, sharp at the edges, soft in the center. A phoenix, maybe, or fire, or rebirth. She didn't say what it was meant to be. Helen didn't ask. She hung it over the fireplace in her apartment, and when she looked at it, she saw both the wreckage and the rising. The building, meanwhile, had stabilized. The new tenants were kind, consistent, respectful, rent came in on time, maintenance requests were minimal. The improvements had paid off. It wasn't just a property anymore. It was an ecosystem, balanced, strong. It no longer needed her constant oversight. And she no longer needed its hold on her past. The final paperwork arrived in early spring, a thick envelope from Leonard, bound neatly, every corner aligned. "Congratulations, Helen," the letter began. "The building has officially been transferred. The last remaining tenants have signed the new agreements. The lawsuit against Mr. Harmon has been resolved in your favor. You are now free to sell, hold, or restructure as you see fit." She read the letter 3 times, then set it aside. She made one phone call that evening, not to Leonard, not to Emily, to a local women's shelter in Austin. She scheduled a meeting, arrived the next week, and sat down across from a director who had spent 20 years building a haven for those with nowhere else to go. Helen wrote a check that day, half the proceeds from the building's sale. She asked for a quiet wing to be built. A place for women like her, women who had been made invisible, who had been pushed out and told they no longer had a place in the world. She requested that the new space bear her mother's name, the Eleanor House. When the check cleared, she felt something settle inside her chest like a knot finally undone. With the remaining half of the money, she bought a house. It was small, just 2 bedrooms. A porch swing out front, white shutters, and a small patch of garden in the back that would be good for tomatoes if she ever decided to plant them. It was on the same street where she had grown up, not far from where Eleanor used to walk her to school. A place unremarkable to most, but saturated with memory for her. She moved in quietly. No boxes marked fragile, no furniture she didn't need. Just clothes, a kettle, a shelf of books, and a new sense of space, both within and around her. On the first night, she stood barefoot on the porch as the sun dipped below the trees. The street was quiet, the wind gentle. She sipped tea and listened to the rustle of leaves. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was waiting for something. She was simply there, present, unburdened. Emily came over the following weekend. She helped unpack, though there wasn't much to carry. They arranged the living room together, laughed over Helen's refusal to own a television, argued briefly over the best place for the coat rack. They made grilled cheese and tomato soup for dinner, just like they used to when Emily was little. The bread burned slightly, and they both blamed the pan. It was the first time either of them had laughed like that in years. Honest, open, easy. They sat on the porch swing afterward, watching the streetlights flicker on. Emily tucked her feet beneath her, wrapped in a blanket. She looked older now, but softer too. Like someone who had been through the fire and found something worth walking back out for. "I remember riding my bike here," she said, voice quiet, "before everything got complicated." Helen nodded. "You were always safe here?" Emily looked at her. "I forgot what that felt like." They didn't speak after that. They didn't need to. Later that night, after Emily left, Helen stood at the front window, holding a cup of tea in both hands. The moonlight stretched across the floor, soft and silver. The house was still, but not silent. It breathed with her. It welcomed her. She set the tea down and retrieved the old diary, Eleanor's diary, from the drawer in her nightstand. She opened it to the back, where the pages were still blank, and slipped in a folded note. Not for herself, for Emily, for someday. The note was simple. You don't need their love to be worthy. You don't need their approval to be strong. You only need the truth. And to never, ever forget who you are. She closed the book gently, returned it to the drawer, and turned out the light. Her tea had gone cold, but her heart was warm. She did not need to scream. She did not need to win. She only needed to be. And now, finally, she was home. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss another one. We have more powerful stories just like this coming your way.